Hi everybody, thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedComsNetworking.com, information services, activities, resources, and so on for people who work in and around the global MedComms community, by which I mean people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, associated businesses, and so on. But importantly, we provide a lot of information for people who'd like to know a bit more about our business in terms of maybe getting a career as a medical writer, account manager, editor, so on and so forth. If you're in that position looking for a job, we have a lot of information at FirstMedCommsJob.com. You'll find careers guides and articles and videos and insights into the business. So go and have a look at that if you haven't done so already. Today, I'm absolutely delighted we've got Vicky Sherwood with us today. And what we're doing today is we're talking about writing tests, which is something that you'll all face if you do look for a job as a medical writer. Basically, whatever part of the business you come into, medical writing tests is a part of that. So Vicky's very kindly come along and she's going to give us her top tips for approaching a medical writing test. So without further ado, Vicky, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for seeing you all here today. So as Peter alluded, I was at his event in Heathrow earlier this month, and I gave a workshop on how to pass a medical writing test where I discussed my top 10 tips for writing test best practice. So I'm delighted now we can come online and share it with a wider audience, because obviously it was only people who could actually attend the event that could come to my workshop at the time. So if you're anything like I was about 7 years ago, when I first realized I wanted to break into medical writing, I was speaking to a recruiter and they told me I'd have to do a writing test as part of the hiring process. And this is exactly how I felt. I mean, this sums up how that word medical writing test, or words medical writing test, made me feel. It made me feel daunted. I didn't know, what it would entail, what would be involved, what would the examiner actually be looking for. And I remember hitting Google and trying to find out more about the medical writing test, and there was very little out there, and I still don't think there's an awful lot out there. So I'm trying to bridge that gap with producing resources and things that can help people with those writing tests. And I know other colleagues that I met at Peter Llewellyn's event are doing the same sort of thing. So this is for anyone who feels a little bit daunted, has never sat a test before, maybe doesn't know really what it's involved, or maybe has sat a few tests but not been successful and don't really know where you're going wrong. For anyone out there who's aspiring writer who's doing that, today's session will hopefully shed some more light on what to do in your writing tests. So what is a writing test? Well, it's basically an assessment that an employer would use to look at your writing skill, but also your ability to interpret data. And that interpretation of data is an important thing for a medical writer. And so that's got to come across strongly in your tests as well. And we'll cover all of this as we go through the session today. I'd say the most common ones that I've sat are these three here, listed here: abstracts, slide decks. For anyone who doesn't know what a slide deck is, just a PowerPoint presentation, but we term it slide deck in industry, in pharma, or copy editing tests, where we're looking at the accuracy and consistency of the writing. So these are the three most common ones that I've sat. But there are others. So I've heard people have to write poster layouts, agendas, summaries. I actually asked this question at the event in Heathrow, and somebody said they actually had to write a lay summary, so a plain language summary for writing tests as well. So there are lots of different types of tests. But I'd say the majority of what you're likely to come across are probably these three. As I said, those three are the most that I've sat, and most, when I ask my colleagues, they're the most of what my colleagues have sat as well. And you may be asked to do a test either at any point in the hiring process, either on site, or they may give you the test that you can do, you can take away and do it. So I'd say the most common way that employers do it, they tend to give you the writing test for a week, and you'll have to submit it within that week. But equally, pre-pandemic, when I was applying for jobs, I was also asked to sit them on site during the interview process as well. So it just depends. And I've also heard of employers that can also send you tests remotely and ask you to submit within a few hours, where they're timed. So there's a lot of variety of ways, but I'd say probably the most common is that they probably give you a week to write it. Okay, So you may be wondering who I am and why I'm here talking to you about writing tests. So I thought I'd just quickly summarize my background so you can understand, what my experience is with writing tests. So prior to breaking into the world of MedComms as a medical writer, I was an academic, a career academic for a long time. I won't tell you how long because it'll give my age away. But in 2017, I actually started my MedComms career at FirstMedCommsJob, working out the Hammersmith office in London. And I started off as a MedComms writer, and I really got my grounding there and learned, the basic skills of MedComms writing. I then worked for another agency, moving a bit more further into central London at Prime Global, working out their office just next to the Tower of London. And then I was actually taken abroad by my husband, and his work took us to Ireland. So I had to actually leave my agency life behind and try and figure out what the MedComms market was like in Ireland at the time. We moved over in 2020 and I was still trying to find my feet. So I started freelancing, and I think this speaks to the flexibility that a medical writing career can give you. If you've got contacts, if you've got experience in the industry, there's always freelancing to fall back on. So I did that for the majority of 2020 before I realized that Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, were hiring MedComms writers as well. And I took an expert scientific writer position there starting in January 2021. Expert scientific writer is basically the same level as a senior or principal medical writer in agency. And then recently this year, at the beginning of this year, I moved back to the UK and took a position as a writing team lead. So now I lead a team of writers at Novartis who write predominantly for the oncology portfolio at Novartis. And I just want to say at this time that everything I say today is for myself. It's nothing to do with Novartis, but I do work for them. And what the team lead job has given me is that I'm actually hiring manager now. So I have to send out the tests and mark the writing tests at Novartis. So this gives me a good insight, both as somebody who sat a lot of tests during my writing career, but also now coming from the other angle as someone who examines them as well. Okay. So I'd like to share my learnings with you today. And I mentioned at the beginning how I'm going to do this is by going through like my top 10 tips of what I think, a good writing test would show. So we'll go through each of these now slide by slide. And the first one might sound quite straightforward or even slightly facetious, really, is stay calm when you get the writing test. But I think this is incredibly important. I think a lot of people panic. I did myself with my first writing test. As I said, I didn't know what to expect. But I think it's important to know that if you've got STEM training and you know how to interpret data and you know how to write scientifically, you have those core skills that are essential to being a good medical writer, and you can employ those skills in your writing practice. So, take a few deep breaths, be calm, and get down to writing, get to the task at hand. Don't procrastinate, just get going. And I also want to state, for anyone who's an aspiring medical writer, if you sit a few tests and you're not successful, that bears absolutely no resemblance to the MedComms professional, writing professional that you can become with some training. So I get a lot of people who say to me, oh, I sat a medical writing test, I didn't pass. I don't think being a medical writer is for me. And that's not necessarily the case, right? It's just that you don't have the core training needed to present that in a way that we would normally do as medical writers. So I would say, if this is an area you really want to break in, do keep pushing, do keep going. And with each test that you do, you'll gain a little bit more experience and confidence, and you'll be able to move forward. And once you break into the industry, then you'll get that training and it will become a lot easier for you going forward. Okay, so that's my first tip. Second tip is, it's very, very, very important that you read the brief carefully. You'll be surprised how many people get this wrong. Okay, so when you're applied with the test, they'll send you a brief, and there's 5 real key things that you want to learn, that you want to get out of that brief, that's important for you to get across in the writing that you do. And the first thing is, obviously, you need to know what you're writing for, but you also need to know the audience that you're writing for as well. That's key. And then you need to know what the source documents are. They should supply those with the test. and you need to familiarise yourself with those, of course. And then you need to know if there are any guidelines you need to be following. And lastly, you need to know the size limit, either the word count or the slide deck number that you're supposed to be working towards, okay, as a maximum, and not to go over that. So those are really the key things. So if we look at this example then, we've got here, it says, find attached the data tables from a double-blinded single-dose PK study in healthy adult volunteers, prepare an adverse event summary of 300 words for an MSL training deck following the AMA manual of style. So we know then we've got to prepare a summary of adverse events. Presumably that's in the data tables that they send through. So that's the source document. So we need to look for that adverse event data. And we know that we're now writing for an MSL training deck. So MSLs are field medical teams that go out, they talk to KOLs, HCPs about pharma products and about therapeutic areas. And so they are subject matter experts. Right? This is a scientific audience. So we know straight away, we don't need to provide them with lots and lots of background information about the therapy, about the drug. Okay, so that's an important thing to note. So we're going to get straight into the data and the science, really. We could put in maybe a refresher piece at the beginning, a couple of sentences or a slide, but not really too much background information. We'll get onto this a little bit later as well. So we know we've got a scientific audience, and we know we're following the AMA manual of style. Okay, so presumably they've attached that as well, because I don't believe it's freely available. All right, so they're the 5 key things that we need to pull out of this brief. Okay, and as I said at the beginning, it's surprising how many people get this wrong. They may write for the wrong audience, right? They're not writing for a scientific audience. Maybe they're writing for a lay audience or the general public, or they go over the word count limit, right? And automatically, right, these things are going to be fails on your test. So all the hard work then that you put into your test beyond this point, if you get the brief, if you don't get these 5 key pieces of information from the brief, it's going to be completely wasted, the rest of the work you do. So it's very, very important that you get this, straight off at the beginning, and that forms your framework of how you're then going to write the document going forward. Okay. Right. So my next tip is 3 key questions. So I have 3 key questions that I always ask myself before I start any kind of medcoms writing that I'm going to do, be it for a writing test or for a client. Okay, and these 3 questions are the following. So the first is, why was the work done? Okay, so you want to know what was the knowledge gap that the researchers were looking to fill, and then you want to know how the work was done, what was the methodology that was employed, and was it robust? And then you want to know, what are the findings, what are the primary results showing? And then once you've pulled all this key information out of the source materials, this is then going to form your narrative, if you like, of what you're then going to present to the reader of whatever the document is that you're writing. Okay, so this is very, very important that you get this established at the beginning. And this is how you should approach reading any kind of scientific information, but it's very important to your writing test that you have this clear and upfront at the beginning. So as you read through the source documents, pull this information out, okay, because then your job is to provide that in a logical and clear way for the reader to absorb this information very easily from whatever it is you're writing. Okay, and alongside that then goes this 4th tip, which is when you pull out that primary data, you want to also present the key data and the statistics for that key data with it. This is actually something that I see a lot of aspiring medical writers not doing in their writing tests, and actually it's a mistake. So you should be showing, when you talk about that key data, you should also be showing the key statistics and data with it. So if we look at this example, what I've pulled out here is a Kaplan-Meier curve, which is looking at overall survival for non-small cell lung cancer patients. Okay, and what they're looking at is 2 arms in this study. So it's a follow-on study, basically from, I think it's a Keystone 1 study. And basically they're looking at 2 arms. So both arms have been treated with pembrolizumab, which is an immune checkpoint inhibitor drug to treat the lung cancer. But some patients have been treated with prior radiotherapy, which is shown in red, and others have no radiotherapy. Okay, so when we're looking at the Kaplan-Meier, basically we're looking at survival. So each of these drops here is somebody unfortunately dying during the study. Okay, so we're looking at overall survival through the treatments. And so what we would say is basically what we're pulling out this information is that if you've had prior radiotherapy, you're less likely to die over time than if you haven't had prior radiotherapy when treated with the antibody pembrolizumab. Okay, so that's the key primary data statement that we need to make within our writing. But the data that supports this is actually the hazard ratio. So the hazard ratio is basically the probability of an event happening, in this case, a death, right, in the treatment arm, in this case, prior radiotherapy treatment versus the control or no radiotherapy treatment. And so when the hazard ratio is less than 1, we're basically saying the probability of an event happening in the treatment arm is actually less than the control arm. Okay, so with a hazard ratio of 0.58, we're showing that you're more likely to survive when you've got prior radiotherapy treatment versus no prior radiotherapy treatment. So when we make that statement in the writing, we need to pull out the hazard ratio in brackets next to it, along with its associated statistics. In this case, the p-value and the CI. Okay, or the confidence interval, I should say. And depending on the study, there could be many types of statistics you might want to present. Could just be the p-value, could be the hazard ratio, as I've shown here, could just be number of patients or percentage of patients, depending on the study, could just be the confidence interval or the mean plus the standard deviation. Okay, so, but it's imperative that when you have that primary data, that you do pull out that associated statistics and you do present it. Okay, so another thing I want to mention, tip number 5, is abbreviations. So abbreviations are incredibly important, particularly in terms of consistency. A lot of people get these wrong. So if I pull out the example that I just showed, okay, we've got a number of abbreviations that I used here, a lot of scientific jargon and terminology. If I was presenting this, say, in a slide deck, and slide decks in pharma can be huge, it can be several hundred slides long often, and they're updated when the clinical trials are updated. The slides are often updated as well. So people tend to go into these decks and look for updated information. We can't necessarily assume that somebody's going to read from the first slide all the way through several hundred slides. So what we tend to do is we always abbreviate on that slide at the bottom. Okay, so you can see I've done that here for confidence interval, hazard ratio, non-small cell lung cancer, etc., etc. Okay, and it's very important that you're consistent with this. You're consistent throughout the deck that you produce, right? So you're always using the same abbreviation and that you don't miss any off on any of the slides. Now, if we were doing a Word document, it's slightly different because in a Word document, we want to abbreviate at first use. Okay, so the first time we use the abbreviation, we abbreviate and then we keep using it, right? So double check that in your Word document that you're using the same abbreviation and that you're not then missing an abbreviation later on in the Word document. But in the slide deck, we need to abbreviate on every slide. And I should also point out as well in the footage, of course, you should reference the source material as well. And also, you know, any notes you want to make about the data shown as well can be shown in the footer there. But the abbreviations are something that people do slip up on. I do as well. I have to double check them. I have to QC them and make sure they're okay. And it is something that examiners are looking for, because we're looking basically for that attention to detail. Okay. Another thing is icons. So in pharma, we absolutely love icons. And I'd say, you know, that's because they increase the visualization of the data that we're showing. And as I said, in pharma, you know, it's a technology based industry. We've got lots of data that we're showing, can often be very text heavy. So if you can break up wordy pieces of information with icons, it can really increase that visualization and help things pop out to the reader. So in a slide deck, for example, we could think about, instead of just having bullets, you might say have an icon, a bullet that's relevant to that piece of information that you're showing. Okay, so I even see in Word documents as well increasing use of icons and you know, boxes to help key pieces of information pull out. Not necessarily for publications, because in publications, of course, they're going to be sent off and the publisher and the editor will work out how to present those. But on internal documents, for example, say you're writing up the minutes for a scientific meeting or what the key takeaway messages were from a particular conversation, say with KOLs, you might there have particular boxes with an icon next to it that highlights key pieces of information in the Word document, or you may even have, you know, speech bubbles that, you know, give the sentiment of, you know, actually stating what somebody said. So these things increase that visualization. They help the reader pull out that key information. And And so, you know, icon use in slide decks in pharma is very important. And it's often something I think as an aspiring writer might not necessarily appreciate. And one thing you can do is just, you know, literally Google some of the pharma companies and you know, put slide deck next to it. And often those slide decks that are produced for oral presentations, you know, for public presentations, you can get an idea of what the style is there. And that's very important because sometimes I think people go to the other way, right? There's too many icons, there's too much color, it's so garish, it's distracting from the key information. So there is a fine line there. And if you don't know what that is, I would suggest, you know, Googling that and having a look, because that's quite important. Okay, tip number 7, try to prepare content where you can yourself. And the reason for this is it will really impress an examiner if you're able to do this. So what a lot of people do is they literally just screen grab out the data and then put it into whatever it is the document that they're writing, particularly in, say, a slide deck. And I think a better way of doing this is to try and present the data in your own way, because that way you can actually show the examiner that you understand the clinical interpretation of the paper better. So for example, if we go back to that Kaplan-Meier that I showed earlier, right, that overall survival data in lung cancer patients, that data is actually shown here as a hazard ratio for overall survival with the associated p-value and the confidence interval. Okay, so we've got that. But if we wanted to make a statement and then, you know, back it up with other information, there's also supplementary information in that paper as well that backs up that key finding, right? The first is that any previous radiotherapy we've shown, but if there's previous extracranial radiotherapy, right? So that's any radiotherapy that's targeting metastases in the body away from the head. That also shows the same result as well. Okay, so it's backing it up, and we can also pull into that data table another parameter, another survival parameter, which is PFS, which is progression-free survival. So this is the amount of time that the patient is on the treatment where their disease has not progressed during that treatment, during the trial period where it's being checked. Okay, so it's another parameter for looking at survival within oncology, and we see again the PFS data is pretty much matching as well the overall survival data that we showed earlier. So if you understand the data enough and the background to the study enough, you can actually really impress an examiner by pulling in other key pieces of information from that paper and presenting it alongside. Now there's caution here, because if you don't understand it enough, it's going to become pretty obvious, you know, straight away if you pull in the wrong pieces of information. Or another thing people tend to do is just pull out everything, right? And we're not looking for everything, we're looking for key information. So what I'm saying here is just pull out key information that supports, or other pieces of information that support that key information. If you can do that, that's very important. And also I think things like demographic tables, you know, don't just screenshot those, you know, actually, you know, in a slide deck, actually write them out, you know, present them out yourself. Don't just screen grab stuff. Obviously with something like a Kaplan-Meier, you're going to have to screen grab, right? Because you'd need a designer to redraw that for you. And that's okay. It's okay to show some, but where you can, try to impress. And I always think data tables are some of the best ways of doing this. Try to impress and pull in extra information to show how much you understand that clinical studies. Very important. It will impress the examiner. And also just want to point out as well, you know, all tables will have to have a table, will have to have a title, and they will have to have footers as well. Okay, so for the example here, we've got the abbreviations under the table, and we've also got other key pieces of information that need to be mentioned to be able to interpret that data accurately. Okay, so tip number 8 is, if you can, this is another thing that will impress the examiner, try to show that you can do some research. Now, this, when I say research, I mean relevant research, right? So a lot of the writing tests that you will receive will be on, mostly I would say clinical trials, but at least clinical data of some sort. So one of the things I see a lot of aspiring medical writers do is they tend to provide a lot of background information either on a disease or a particular drug. And if you're writing for a scientific audience, I alluded to this at the beginning, it's not really necessary to go into too much background information on that, maybe just a refresher slide or two. So when I say pull in relevant research to the data, if it's a clinical trial, there's a few key things that potentially can impress an examiner if you do this. Okay, so the first is to show the study design. So if you show the study design, particularly in a slide deck, then you're able to impress on the examiner that you've understood how that study was done. So you can present it in some way like this. This is a typical way we might present a study. So here we've got lung cancer patients again, and we're looking at the inclusion criteria. Okay, so which patients were enrolled into this study at the beginning, and then we show what happens to them throughout the study. Okay, so they get randomized 1-to-1 in the study. So it's a randomized control trial into 2 arms, and they're treated with pembrolizumab again, but they're treated with pembrolizumab in 2 different regimens, either once every 3 weeks or once a fortnight. Okay, so this is quite a simple study. Can have more complex studies than this. Some can be more difficult to draw because you can have follow-ons and multiple treatment arms, things like that. But if you can do something like this accurately, it will show to the examiner that you understand, you know, what was involved in the study. Another thing you can do if it's a clinical trial is pull out the NCT number from clinicaltrials.gov. Like, this is the national clinical trial number. All clinical trials will have this number, and it enables somebody, if you just literally, you know, hyperlink it through, if it's a slide deck, or just put it into the Word document, it literally allows somebody to go there and learn a little bit more about the study if they were interested in looking at that. Okay, and then you can get a lot of useful information. If it's a licensed drug, right, if it's for sale, you can get a lot of information from the package insert. So a couple of key things that are really cool to include, I think, are pivotal phase 3 studies. So what were those studies that enabled that drug to get its license, either from the FDA or the EMA? Those will be published in that package insert. You can easily pull those out. And what other indications was that drug used for? Okay, so what other diseases is that drug used to treat? And what also, it will show what contraindications as well, when you shouldn't use the drug. Okay, so if you can pull out pieces of information like that, you will really, really impress your examiner, especially for an aspiring medical writer. Very, very few do that. So those kind of 4 key things there, if you include those in your writing test, you will blow the examiner away, I would say. Okay, then it's really important to think about your sentence structure and flow. So we're on the penultimate tip here, and I've left 2 really good ones for the end here. So in terms of the sentence structure and flow, two key things I think that are important. The first is to be as clear as you can in your writing, and a good rule of thumb here is to make 1 point per sentence. Okay, so a lot of people make the mistake where they try to cram, because there's a word count limit, they try to cram a number of key points into 1 sentence, and you lose that clarity. So it does take a little bit of wordsmithing, but if you find that you've written something and you're looking back and you're reading over it and you've made a couple, I've even seen people try to make 3 key points within 1 sentence before, just see how you can break that sentence up into smaller sentences. It's more digestible for the reader. It will increase the clarity no end. And also think about how those individual points flow into the next point, right? That's when we're talking about the narrative. Guide that reader through that narrative from the beginning to the end as best you can, because that's really going to help them get that key takeaway messages and remember those, okay? Because that's what's going to impress if you've got that kind of readability and clarity and logic to your writing style. If you follow these 2 things, your writing style, sentence structure and flow will improve no end. And that's basically what we're aiming for as medical writers, to be as clear as possible. Okay, and then last, I've left QCing, or quality control. Okay, this is really, really, really important, and I've alluded to this throughout this whole presentation. And I'd say focus on 4 key things and try and give yourself enough time after the test. So if you've got a week, try to work it such that, you know, you've got a day spare. You could even, if you want, for grammatical errors, ask somebody else to have a quick look at it if you can find anybody who's got the time. But at least give yourself an extra day and look at it the day before you submit, the day after, because that's going to, you're going to notice errors and mistakes there than if you're looking at it without fresh eyes just before the submission. Likewise, if you're on a time test, so say they've given you an hour, try to give yourself 5-10 minutes at the end just to quickly read through and check everything as best you can. You're probably going to need 10 minutes probably, because the number of things you need to check and be consistent on as a medical writer is really important. This attention to detail, as I said, is what we're looking for. So the first thing, and I've alluded to this before, is consistency. You know, be consistent with everything. Your abbreviations is important. I always check those when I'm looking at a writing test, and also the use of British versus international or US spelling. Okay, be consistent with that. And this is a common mistake I often see, which is this patients versus participants issue. Okay, so if they're a patient, they've got a disease. If they're a participant, you know, if they're a volunteer in a study, be clear about that. Don't muddle them up. They're not interchangeable necessarily. And so a few people get that wrong. So be consistent with that. It's a common mistake I see. Of course, grammatical errors, you need to be consistent. You need to be checking those and consistent with your grammar, with your spelling, your punctuation. As I said, you might have the opportunity to have somebody else have a quick look. If not, just make sure you haven't made any terrible glaring errors with your spelling and your punctuation. Data errors, these are really important, because if you get the data wrong, that's an absolute no-no for a medical writer. So we have to check everything. In fact, when you're working as a medical writer in the industry, you'll get somebody to actually QC through your data. And when I say the data, I mean the data that you're using in the text, in the figures, in the tables, all of it. Double check it, because as an examiner, I check it as well. I make sure that the data is accurate, and if it's not, it's a fail. So it's really, really important to check your data. And then lastly, of course, make sure you're using formal language. This is a formal document, right? So we don't want, to be shortening things like did not to didn't, right? So the study did not show, not the study didn't show. We don't want to be using colloquialisms in the way that we kind of discuss things or how we talk to one another. We want to be using formal language. So we don't say something like the patient got over her disease, right? We need to say something like the patient recovered from her disease. So it's a formal document, as I said. You'll be surprised again how many people do use colloquialisms in their writing. And again, it's a bit of a black mark, really, if you use anything like that. Okay, so let me just summarize quickly what we've been through. So the top 10 tips for passing a medical writing test is: number one, stay calm, right? You've got the core skills to pass this. Make sure you're reading the document and understanding and interpreting it correctly, and you're going to be fine. Okay, just be clear in your writing style as well. As I said, read the brief carefully. Okay, we've got those 5 things we want to know from the brief. We want to know what we're writing, who we're writing for, what the size of the document is, what the guidelines for the document are, and we also need to know, oh, what was the last one? I've forgotten one. Did I say 5? Size limits. Oh, where the source information is. That was the 5th one I think I didn't mention. So just to reiterate, who you're writing for, what you're writing, the source information, the size limit, and the guidelines. Okay, so those 5 key things, if you get those wrong at the beginning, it's going to be a mistake, right? You're going to make a mistake, and then the rest of the work that you do is going to be, basically a waste of time, because it's going to be a fail straight up. Okay. Then when you're reading the source information, you want to understand why the study was done, how the study was done, what the methodology was, and what was found, that key information. And with that key information, that leads nicely on to tip 4, because we want to include that key data, that statistics. And I gave an example there of a hazard ratio that you could include, but there's a number of key statistics. But do always include that key data and the statistics associated with it. Define your abbreviations and be consistent with them. And I spoke about how to define them in a slide deck versus, say, in a Word document. use icons in a slide deck. Use them sparingly, but use them to be able to highlight key information. And we spoke as well about, not making it too garish, not having too much, it's distracting. Okay, there is that fine line, but likewise, you need to use them to give that kind of professional edge to any slide deck that you're producing. Where you can, where possible, use your own content and think about the data, think about the wider data, what's in the supplementary information, anything else you can pull out that can support that key data. Again, we're not looking to pull everything out, we're just looking to pull out that key data, but if there's anything supporting that can demonstrate how well you understand that clinical data, do include that and present it. Data tables are a good way of doing that. Include any relevant research. So when I say relevant, I meant relevant in terms of like if it was a clinical trial, we'd include something like the study data, the NCT number, what diseases that drug is used for, when it's not used, things like that. That will really impress the examiner. And then be clear in your writing structure and your flow. So make sure you use, 1 point per sentence as a rule of thumb, is a good thing to follow, and make sure 1 point leads into another as best you can to improve the reading, the narrative through the reading that you're doing, the writing that you're doing for the reader. And then lastly, QC everything. Be consistent, check your grammar, check your spelling, QC the data, incredibly important. Lots of people make that mistake. They have the wrong data, either in the text or in the table. And use formal language throughout. So I'd say if you follow these 10 tips, you'll be well on your way to passing your medical writing test. And as an aspiring writer, there's things here that are very advanced, and you'll be surprised, even people who apply to jobs at principal writer level who get things wrong, as some of the things that I've discussed here today. So if you're able to follow these and do these in your writing test as an aspiring writer, you'll absolutely blow your examiner away, and you will pass for sure. Okay, so then I just wanted to mention lastly, if you found this useful, I talk a lot about writing tests, how to write abstract slide decks, ad boards, guidelines that we use in MedComms, how to interpret data. I talk a lot about this on my blog, which is the biomedbadass.com blog, and I give a lot of information away through email. So do make sure that you subscribe to that. And recently this year, we launched a course, how to break into medical writing in MedComms, and we'll be running it again next year. I'll be running it with 2 other medical writers from my colleagues, Rena Passmore and Vera Cham. And if you're interested in, breaking into the world of MedComms and gaining some skills in medical writing, so when you get in your first position, you'll hit the ground running. We'll be presenting a lot of those throughout the course, and we'll be running it again next year. So the first place you'll hear about that is if you subscribe to the Biomed Badass mailing list, and we'll be highlighting when that course is launching again next year if you're interested. Okay, right, Peter, I kind of garbled through that quickly. I don't know how long. Yeah. Okay,
that's fine.
It's taken a bit longer than I thought. Sorry.
Yeah, don't worry. But can we lose the slides? And we're just sure. In the last few minutes, but we are a little bit over time. So we've had a number of questions coming in. I would ask people in the audience today, use the 2 text boxes to ask your questions or any observations. We need to be a little bit careful because some of them are a little bit specific, and I think we need to be a bit careful. But maybe we can come back to those when we finish the recording, or you can follow up individually. So use the text boxes, and we'll try just for a few minutes to build that in. I just thought can I just throw a couple of things at you? I think one of the things, and I speak as a non-medical writer, okay, so let's be very clear about this. I observe this, right? One of the things I say to people is, and you alluded to it, but I think it's worth making the point, is that when you're taking a medical writing test at an entry level, for an entry level position, the employer is not expecting you to be a medical writer. I think there's quite an important point in there. Yeah. They are looking for the attributes of, they're looking to see whether they can train you. So I think when you take a writing test, chill a little bit. Yeah, there's no magic answer to this. They're not expecting you to be a medical writer as such. So a lot of your tips are, at the end of the day, fairly common sense, can I put it like that? You know, read the brief, answer the brief, things like that are hugely important. If you do that, you're going to demonstrate your ability to become a medical writer. I think there's just a really important point that people get a bit tied up in this. You know, if I haven't got, you know, if I haven't been on the course how to pass a medical writing test, how can I pass a medical writing test? That's not really the sort of point. And another point that you again brought out, which I always stress to people from where I sit seems important, is what's the message? There's a message in there. That's what you're trying. So don't go on about the methodology. Find the message, which is usually something along the lines of this medicine is better than that medicine, or particularly beneficial for this group of patients, or something. And that's what you want to focus on. Does that make? Do you agree with that? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Really
Yeah.
Okay. And that business about the brief, again, a point I make to people is, in my experience anyway, people who are setting these medical writing tests aren't trying to catch you out. It's in the brief. If it's not in the brief, really not in the brief, then go back and ask. But they're not really playing games with you, I think is certainly my my sort of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you know, and I did allude to that. You know, that what question is the key information, isn't it? And like you said, no one's trying to catch you out, but they do want to know that you can interpret that data. That is something. If the data interpretation is wrong, I realize somebody hasn't understood the study. As a hiring manager, I don't have time to go over that, you know, scientific understanding. So, you know, for me, that's an absolute no. And also these things like consistency about abbreviations and things, I'm looking for that eye for detail. So these are things that I feel like if somebody's able to demonstrate those to me, then I don't have to train. You know, there's things I don't have time to train on, right? I don't have time to train somebody on scientific interpretation and understanding. But I can train them on, you know, how to present a slide, right, in a slide deck, right? So, you know, of course, you know, we're looking at the level of expertise somebody has, and we're assessing, you know, how much we would have to train somebody. And as an aspiring writer, like you said, I don't expect somebody to be a medical writer, and some of this stuff was a bit more advanced, right? But you'll be surprised, even, as I said, and I think I alluded to this, you know, people who are at principal level still making, you know, mistakes or not checking and don't pass medical writing tests that we get through. So yeah, just
there's a point in there as well, isn't there? That's maybe worth clarifying for people, is that this medical writing test doesn't only happen at an entry level stage. I think some writers get a little bit sort of like thrown when we're applying for principal, senior principal, whatever medical writer. They're still being presented with medical writing tests, which is also just a reflection of the fact that different people test in slightly different ways. Every employer has slightly different things they're looking for, and so on. They want you to see whether you're going to be able to work to their standard, if you like, or the way they're working. The question came in about freelancers. Again, you know, a lot of freelance writers get slightly sort of confused by the fact they're being given a writing test. There's lots of good reasons for that. So don't see this as just something you magically do at the beginning and never come back to, sort of thing. Yeah. One thing which I thought was maybe worth touching on, we've had a couple of questions about the PowerPoint. You talked, you know, obviously a lot of what you're talking about was based around the idea you're putting a slide set together of some sort. Again, how expert do you need to be in PowerPoint? I mean, I suppose my simple point would be, you're not an expert in PowerPoint. Again, they'll be trained, but you can show that you can understand how data can look sensible on a slide. You can do it well without being an expert, or you can make it look like you don't understand the basics, and that's really what you're looking at, isn't it? Yes,
exactly. And again, it's about getting that key information out. And I did try to allude to this a lot of times. You know, a lot of people say you get a test that's saying, you know, write 5 slides on X study for scientific audience, and then they'll spend 3 slides maybe talking about the therapeutic area or the disease setting, and then they're not giving themselves enough space to demonstrate that they understand the data, right? So it's very critical that you you use the space you've got sparingly and you get that right information across. And again, as you know, we're not expecting it to be perfectly professional looking, but likewise, if it's totally garish or all over the place or can't get the information out, it's not clear, you know, that you're not going to pass that way. So that's why I said, you know, try and have a look at some pharma slide decks if you can find some on the internet. And there are. You just Google, like I said, just Google the name of the pharma company plus, you know, slide deck, and you will pull some up. And we all use similar sorts of style, so you can pretty quickly get a flavour for the style that you should probably be aiming for, that you can impress with.
It's amazing what you can find on Google, isn't it? Well, just to finish, let's just finish with again a quick point, which again I tend to make. So, do you agree? If you take, and it's a common criticism within and around MedComms, taking medical writing tests. I did my test, I've submitted it, I've not got any feedback. I've just been told no or something like that. I suppose my answer to that is, bear in mind everyone's busy, so I'm already making excuses for them. But you know, in principle, there's no harm in going back to somebody and saying, can I have a little bit of feedback? You know, I think, again, you said very clearly, failing the test doesn't write you off as a medical writer, but it would be nice to get a little bit of feedback. And some MedComms agencies in particular now are making something of the fact that they do very specifically give feedback. But as a general point, there's no harm going back and saying, can you just give me some guidance? Would you agree?
Yeah, you know, I've never had feedback from a writing test, I can honestly say. It does seem to be a bit of a black hole, but there's no harm. There's no harm. And I actually have seen some feedback from colleagues that they've received. Tends to be 1 or 2 sentences, not necessarily in depth, but it could give you a couple of pointers, definitely. But as I said, the more kind of tests you do, the more familiarity you get with these, you'll soon get up to speed with what the expectations are. In a session like this, you know, I'm setting out, you know, what the gold standard would be, if you like, of what I'm looking for when I'm marking a test. But yeah, try and the key thing again is to get across that you understand the study, you understand the data, and you're able to get that across in a clear way. And if you fulfill that, you're going to pass. And also that you've not made glaring errors. Either in the data or in the text. And I think if you feel those things as an aspiring writer, you'll be fine.
Okay, cool. Let's stop on that note. And the attention to detail type of thing is always worth just highlighting right at the end. It's amazing how many people don't just give it that double check and then fall down on the simplest of things. So let's draw a line there. There's some questions we could pick up in the next few minutes. So if you're watching this at the moment, stick around. But for the moment, I think we'll stop the recording there. I'm going to say a huge thanks to Vicky. I know you're very happy to hear from people via LinkedIn or via your website. Very easy to contact you, and you provide lots of great resources. So if we can just give everybody a wave, we're going to stop the recording. And if anybody's interested in what I'm doing, FirstMedCommsJob.com will give you lots of advice on joining the business, or MedComsNetworking.com, lots and lots of resources for people who work in and around the business. So on that note, thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.